many historians and general observers have been of the opinion that modernity, the phenomenon that we speak of, the modernity or the modern era, dawned only in the 18th century, and not only 18th century all over the world, but specifically in the context of Europe.
The Industrial Revolution serves as a key to the origins of modern Western society. But the revolution was something more than just new machines, smoke-belching factories, increased productivity, and an increased standard of living. It was a revolution which transformed English, European, and American society down to its very roots. Everyone was touched in one way or another: peasant and noble, parent and child, artisan and captain of industry.
The Industrial Revolution plots a series of transformations in the manner of production and then eventually of distribution of manufactured goods.
It was a period from the 18th to the 19th century where major changes in agriculture, manufacturing, mining, transportation and technology had a profound effect on the socio-economic and cultural conditions of the times.
The roots of the story lie actually in the transformation of European economy in the 17th century and in the first half of the 18th century. In medieval Europe, or in even early modern Europe as late as the 16th century, principal manufacturing sector or the principal industrial sector used to be located in the towns.
In the cities, merchandise was made in shops much like those of the medieval craftsmen, and manufacturing was strictly regulated by the guilds and by the government. The goods made in these shops, though of high quality, were limited and costly.
It was this guild-based production that had sustained the manufacturing sector in Europe for a period of more than a millennium, more than 1,000 years. European industrial production was dominated by the diktats of the guild. First in Roman times, then in the post-Roman period when it went through a decline, and then its revival in the 11th and 12th centuries. However, by the 17th century, as the volume of colonial commerce began to grow, and as Europeans became exposed to the manufacturing sector all over the world, the necessities of transformation began to weigh heavy on them. Because there were some products which Europe manufactured for which there was some substantial demand, definitely in Levantine part of Asia, in the colder climes of Central Asia and in the Ottoman Empire. And in such regions, the wool that Europe generated, or the metal manufacturers of Europe that used to have a steady demand in the Levantine regions of Asia and Northern Africa. The quantum of demand began to grow with time because of the superiority of European products.
The merchants needed cheaper items as well as larger quantities for their growing trade. As early as the 15th century, they already had begun to go outside the cities, beyond the reach of the hampering regulations, and to establish another system of producing goods.
Two types of production methods had been adopted. First is the one that Marx had spoken of, the primitive accumulation of capital. Marx would say, began when the individual artisan in the countryside began to market his wares with the urban merchants. That is to say, the initiative lay with the producer. He was producing something which the merchant came and took away from him by paying him exchange price. This is known as the Kauf system, from the German term kaufen, where the merchant goes and buys a product that is already made. Peter Kreidler introduced a second major, version of the same system of procuring materials from the countryside. Peter Creeder spoke of a Ferlach system, or the putting out system.
Cloth merchants, for instance, would buy raw wool from the sheep owners, have it spun into yarn by farmers' wives, and take it to the country weavers to be made into textiles. These country weavers could manufacture the cloth more cheaply than city craftsmen could, because they got part of their living from their gardens or small farms. The merchants would then collect the cloth and give it out again to finishers and dyers. Thus they controlled cloth making from start to finish. Similar methods of organizing and controlling the process of manufacture came to prevail in other industries such as the nail, cutlery and leather goods.
At this stage, the amount of produce was not any longer regulated by what the urban guilds were stipulating. As and when demands increased, supply could also increase, because the merchant would go out into the countryside and procure whatever needed to be procured. This led to, of course, stimulation of commerce.
This system of industry had several advantages. It gave the merchant a large supply of manufactured articles at a low price. It also enabled him to order the particular kinds of items that he needed for his markets. It provided employment for every member of a craft worker's family and gave jobs to skilled workers who had no capital to start business for themselves.
As the lure of the expansion of commercial horizons was very clear, a larger number of merchants now began to bypass the urban guilds and go out to the countryside. This coincided with the expansion of European colonies of settlement in the Americas, in what was to later become Australia, in the southern tip of Africa, just about in all the continents, as Europeans began to move, first as merchants, then as settlers. The expansion of colonial horizon generated a major demand for products which only 200 years back had very little market outside Europe itself.
At this stage, average income and population began to exhibit unprecedented sustained growth. Europe's average per capita income increased over tenfold, while population increased over sixfold.
The merchant in the putting out system, both in the Kauf system and in the Ferlach system, was ultimately dependent on the goodwill of the man who was doing the actual production. And why was the man who was doing the actual production engaged in this? Generally what happened is that the merchants would go out to the countryside and look for artisans, because the guilds were also expensive. Once the guild is setting up prices, these prices would be set generally high because the guild monopolized production. And one of the incentives that the merchants had was to break this monopoly by pushing the prices down. Now the artisans in the countryside were all generally tended to be part-time cultivators, either owning their own land, marginal farmers, or landless laborers. And these people used to look upon artisanal production as something like a supplementary income, which basically meant that while agricultural activity provided their basic daily needs, for supplementary income they were doing a little more. In other words, it was not earning their bread, as it were, but merely earning their shirt. The implication was that the merchants could pay the artisans less than what they would have to pay in the urban guilds. This had its flip side as well, because the person who is earning his bread principally by means of agriculture and is using artisanal production as means of earning supplementary income would not be available for any industrial activity, for any artisanal activity, for the purpose of artisanal production during the harvest season. So when the sowing season was there, or the harvest season was there, when the agricultural seasons were in vogue, when labor would be required on the land, a merchant, he may come up with however large an order he chose, but he would not find any laborer. That is to say, production in the putting out system tended to be essentially periodic, seasonal. It was possible only during the lean season in agriculture, but it was not possible during the peak season in agriculture. There was a second factor. Under the Ferlach system, a merchant handed out material, put out material, and the artisans would produce it and bring them back. Now there would be differences in terms of the quality of the work that various artisans would be able to produce. So the same material handed out to two different people in two different villages could result in a varying quality of goods. There was a third problem. Under the Kauf system, when the merchant was going out and buying something, there was no guarantee that the thing would be sold to him. By the early 18th century, the quantum of demand for these goods had attained such a position that it was becoming extremely difficult for the merchants to be content with seasonal production. It was with this aim in mind, it was with this problem in mind that in the early 18th century, some merchants began to toy with the idea of a workshop. In a workshop, what happened was a merchant would hire artisans from the local setting to come together and work under the factory shed for a time. That way, the merchant would at least be able to regulate, to monitor the work that was actually being done. Because in the privacy of his own household, an artisan may have taken the money, but he may simply idle his hours away, not producing something. And that would make the merchant lose out, because he would lose out on the order which he was meaning to deliver.
A few merchants who had enough capital took up a space to establish workshops. They brought workers together under one roof and supplied them with spinning wheels and looms, or with the implements of other trades. These establishments were factories, though they bear slight resemblance to the factories of today.
This is basically the beginning of the regimentation of the working hours. This is basically the beginning from where you have factory hours, where the working day begins at a particular time and ends at a particular time, maybe with a tiffin break thrown in between. Even this, however, began to prove insufficient for the growing volume of demand. First, on the one hand, population was increasing, but with the growing expansion of the market horizons, as more and more goods needed to be produced, there was this additional requirement that goods needed to be produced not only in greater volumes, but also on a shorter time. They have to be produced faster, and they had to be produced cheaper. And this was ultimately what pushed Europe towards mechanization of production.
Starting in the latter part of the 18th century, there began a transition in England's manual labour and animal power-based economy towards machine-based manufacturing. It started with the mechanization of textile industries, the development of iron-making techniques, and the increased use of refined coal. Trade expansion was enabled by the introduction of canals, improved roads and railways. The winds of change first blew in the United Kingdom, then subsequently spread throughout Europe, North America, and eventually the world.
If we take the sector that was most crucial in the making of the Industrial Revolution, the textile industry, the real challenge was to produce not only a standard quality of cloth, but actually not only a better quality of cloth, but a cheaper quality of cloth, because more and more people needed to be clothed. More and more people needed to be clothed, but not all of these people were wealthy enough to buy expensive clothes. So the clothes would also have to be cheap. Now, for someone who was specializing in production of luxury items such as silk, this had no meaning.
Arguably, the first mechanized mill was John Long's water-powered silk mill at Derby, which was made operational by 1721. However, the rise of the factory came somewhat later when cotton spinning was mechanized.
But someone who was willing to invest a little bit of money in cotton textile production, the market horizons were colossally large. And as more and more merchants began to develop an interest in controlling this process of production, there was greater incentive actually to invest in some sort of technology that would make the production both cheaper and faster and possibly also better.
The flying shuttle, invented in 1733, enabled one person to handle a wide loom more rapidly than two persons could operate it before. As the flying shuttle sped up weaving, the demand for cotton yarn increased. James Hargreaves, a weaver who was also a carpenter, patented his spinning jenny in 1770. It enabled one worker to run 8 spindles instead of 1.
It was not possible, for instance, for the merchant to bring a spinning jenny and hand it over to the artisan, because then the artisan would be manufacturing products for a large number of merchants if we so choose, although the investment was being made by only one person. So the technological innovations required complete relocation of the production process from either the workshop, from either the house of the artisan himself, or even a workshop run by a local agent. It would have to be under the direct control of the merchant himself. It was primarily with this aim in mind that industrial production began to be shifted away from the cottages, which is the reason why we call these cottage industries, and relocated to the factory system, to the factory owned by the merchant. He owns the land, he invests in the machine, and in this he is not dependent on the skill of the laborer. Unlike in the artisanal system, in the new system where machinery was being introduced, the machine was meant to perform the work of a number of laborers by itself. So when it came to, for instance, mechanization of spinning or weaving, the character of machine was basically to de-skill the process of production.
The change was particularly hard on the weavers and other skilled workers who sank to the position of factory workers. They had been independent masters, capitalists in a small way, and managers of their own business. They had pride in their skill. When they saw themselves working at other men's bidding for the same pay as unskilled workers, it is no wonder that they rioted and broke up looms.
It was becoming more and more possible to produce cheaper, faster and better.
Children could tend most of the machines as well as older persons could, and they could be hired for less pay. Hundreds of children were made to work from 12 to 14 hours a day under terrible conditions. Many were apprenticed to the factory owners and housed in miserable dormitories. Ill-fed and ill-clothed, they were sometimes driven under the lash of the supervisor. The high death rate of these child slaves eventually roused Parliament to pass laws limiting the daily toil of apprentices. In the wake of the revolution, new social relationships appeared. Men were no longer treated as men, but as commodity which could be bought and sold on the open market.
There was an additional factor in terms of energy, and which is where some people, historians like David Landis, for instance, would argue, was the nub of the Industrial Revolution. Because the Industrial Revolution rested upon moving from animate sources of energy to inanimate sources of energy. Earlier, it's not that there were no machines earlier, there were plenty. But generally, machines would be operated by animate sources of energy, animal power.
For much of the 19th century, production was done in small mills, which were typically water-powered and built to serve local needs. Later, each factory would have its own steam engine and a chimney to give an efficient draft through its boiler.
As a larger volume needed to be produced, as a larger volume of produce was required, more and more machines needed to be manufactured. This prompted the changes in metalworks industry.
The major change in the metal industries during the era of the Industrial Revolution was the replacement of organic fuels based on wood with fossil fuel based on coal. Iron became cheaper and more plentiful. It also became a major structural material for building tall edifices and bridges. To manufacture iron, there was a demand for more coal.
Mines would have to be penetrated deeper, and as more and more penetration was required, the growing energy necessity of coal, for instance, ultimately brought the problem of water seeping into the mines. As deep drilling began, water began to seep out of the mines and began to ruin the resources.
Newly invented Newcomb engines were put to use in Britain for draining hitherto unworkable deep mines. They were extremely inefficient by modern standards. The adoption of James Watt's more efficient steam engine in the 1770s reduced the fuel costs of engines, making mines more profitable. From the 1780s, the steam engine was applied to power other types of machines. This enabled rapid development of efficient semi-automated factories on previously unimaginable scale in places where water power was not available.
Such transformations of both the organization, the location moved from artisanal production of the cottage industry to machine-driven production of the factory. Such relocation of the character of labor from a highly skilled artisan to a de-skilled wage laborer, and the shift from animate source of energy such as bullock power or horsepower to coal and eventually hydel powers, electricity, all these transformations together, they make up the Industrial Revolution. Once the commercial horizons began to expand relentlessly, the road to Industrial Revolution was paved.
As Harold Perkin has observed, the Industrial Revolution was no mere sequence of changes in industrial techniques and production, but a social revolution with social causes as well as profound social effects. The Industrial Revolution can be said to have made the European working class. It made the European middle class as well. In the words of Nobel Prize winner Robert E. Lucas Jr., for the first time in history, the living standards of the masses of ordinary people have begun to undergo sustained growth. Nothing remotely like this economic behavior has happened before.